Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel, and in today's episode we will explore the political philosophy of John Stuart Mill, who is known as one of the greatest liberal thinkers of the 19th century. He talked about individual liberty and utilitarian ethics, and when we talk about present-day democracy, we see that his ideas continue to shape the concept of democracy, freedom and governance. And it's very important to have an idea of what his early life was like. So James Mill was his father. Sorry for the stuttering. John Stuart Mill was the son of James Mill, and James Mill was a friend of Jeremy Bentham. We talked about Jeremy Bentham in the last video. So Jeremy Bentham was also a utilitarianist philosopher, and so was James Mill. James Mill was the father of John Stuart Mill. So basically, John Stuart Mill had an exposure of utilitarianist philosophy in his early ages. And since his father was a very learned person, he belonged to the nobility of the Great Britain. And he was a very famous lawyer. And hence, since an early age, John Stuart Mill had exposure to Greek, Latin, logic, and economics. And by the age of 12, he had read all major classical philosophers. But unfortunately, Mill was not a very strong person emotionally and socially, and that is why he had a nervous breakdown at the age of 20, which led him to question the cold mechanical version of utilitarianism he was raised with. So, sometimes when you are growing up, you are taught certain things and you are made to believe that these are the right versions of, your religion or these ideas or political narratives. But when you grow, you realize that no, what I've been taught is just one side of the story. So that was the problem with Mill. He realized that the kind of utilitarianism that was propagated or promoted by Jeremy Bentham and his father, James Mill, was something that he did not agree with. He believed that he was not supposed to comply with what his elders had told him to do. So that is why we see Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill both are utilitarianist philosophers, but both of these have a huge difference in the way they approach the utilitarianism's idea in politics, economics, and democracy. And that is why we see John Stuart Mill is also known as a romantic poet, because he had a more humane and individualistic approach to politics. Then, of course, it's very important to discuss what shaped John Stuart Mill's political philosophy. So first, it was Bentham's utilitarianism. Now, you can talk about it in a positive or in a negative way. As I mentioned, he was negatively impacted by Bentham's utilitarianism, but at the same time, he was drawn towards utilitarianism as well. And that also because he was surrounded by great minds like James Mill and Bentham. So utilitarianism's concept that was kind of quantified by Bentham was something that actually helped him sow the seed of a more rationalized approach of utilitarianism. And then, of course, it was also the period of enlightenment. It was the period where education, democracy, freedom, individualism, civic sense was given importance, and that is why we see his idea of utilitarianism is more focused on individual rights and democracy. And again, he was someone who believed in the depth of human experience. He did not believe in quantifying emotions or laws or any kind of governance aspects. He believed that things need to be seen in the prism of quality. And that is why we call him a romantic philosopher as well. And at the same time, there was also the rise of capitalism. So when we talk about Bentham had only focused on political side of utilitarianism, but John Stuart Mill had taken into account the rise of economic division in society, and he kind of linked it with politics and democracy, and he also linked it with the core concept of utilitarianism. So this was something that was new to the modern political thought that was prevailing back in those days. So now when we talk about the core concepts of Mill's political philosophy, there are a few points that we must know, and they are as following. So John Stuart Mill talked about liberty and individual freedom. So John Stuart Mill had a very famous book on liberty, which was published in the year 1859, in which he propagates his famous idea that the only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way. This clearly signifies the core concept of utilitarianism, and he championed freedom of thought, expression, action, and lifestyle as long as it did not harm others. He believed that personal liberty is essential for human progress, innovation, and moral development. And at the same time, he was of the opinion that government's interference should be minimal unless it prevents harm to others. So basically, it's just like restricting the role of government in such cases where the benefit or the interest of the greater number of people is at stake. Otherwise, people have all the rights and all the authority to follow the kind of lifestyle they want to follow. This kind of laid the foundation of liberal democracy, constitutional rights, and the freedom of speech. And then he also talks about the harm principle. So Mill said that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others, which in simple words means that if a person is being stopped to exercise his own choice, it is only because a fear is preeminent. It is, it is feared that the harm to others might be at a greater stake. That is why, a person must be stopped from following their own whims. So this means that the state cannot restrict an individual's liberty for their own good, only to protect others from harm. This also highlights another aspect of government, that the role of government is not to maintain its own good and wellness. The major purpose of state is to restrict citizens and to, kind of promote restriction in their liberties, only if it is in the favor of the people. So you see, Mill kind of links government and laws with every aspect of utilitarianism, and he opposed paternalism and authoritarianism. So paternalism is something which is, of course, kind of an authoritarianism, but in paternalism we talk about manipulation of laws to restrict the freedom of the individuals. And then he also talked about the freedom of speech and expression, in which he said that the truth emerges from the clash of ideas. He was not against restriction of speech. He believed that everyone should have the right to speak. Even if someone has a false opinion, he must be given the right to speak, at least, even if you do not agree with it. Because he said that if someone is wrong in their place, at least they have the freedom to speak, and this is something that can help them in their personal development. And he also said that, if someone does not agree with what the majority is saying, it means that the minority idea might have at least a tad bit of truth to it, because it's not important that whatever the majority is saying is right every time. And that is why he also warned against the tyranny of the majority. This tyranny of the majority is the basic premise of Mill's political philosophy, which we'll be discussing in his later points as well. He also talked about qualitative utilitarianism, which is the biggest difference that he has with Bentham. Bentham talked about quantitative utilitarianism, dividing it into intensity, duration, quality, and such different, not quality, I'm sorry about that, about different characteristics. But when we talk about Mill said that some players are superior in quality, not just quantity. Mental players, for example, art, intellect, and morality, are higher than bodily players like food and comfort. As he famously said, that it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. So understand the technicalities of what he's trying to say. And then he also talked about individuality and self-development. He relates individuality and self-development with the idea of freedom of speech, where he says that even if a person who is not educated, who believes that he's saying the truth, but in reality he might be coming from a place of, you can say, from a place of deceit or from a place of falsification, let that person speak. Because when a person speaks their mind, it actually helps them develop their skills. It helps them develop their attributes that can help them become better citizens. And he linked it with social progress, human flourishing, and cultural development. And he also said that, when you stop a society, when you limit a society's ability to speak, the society kind of becomes very stagnant. It is because the individuality is limited, it is reduced. And then he also talked about representative government and democracy. He supported democracy, but of course he had a few conditions attached to it. He said that democracy is important as it ensures accountability and education of citizens, but at the same time, he said that political participation is a way to educate and morally uplift individuals. Hence, it should be backed by plural voting and restrictions on unqualified voters. I know this would be something very controversial, and we'll be discussing this in the later points. So let's move forward. He also talked about women's rights. He had a very famous book, The Subjugation of the Rights of the Women, which was published in 1869. It is known as a magnum opus in the first wave of liberalism. If you have gender studies as your optional subject in CSS, you must have heard of this book, in which he advocated for equality of the sexes in education, politics, and marriage. He argued that the subjugation of women was a social construct, not natural law. He called for women's suffrage, legal rights, and access to public roles, which was very important and which was very revolutionary at his time. He also talked about economic justice and social welfare. Now, Mill supported individual property rights, but also believed in redistribution and state welfare. Now, I said that at the time when Mill was in his youth or when he was a budding philosopher, the industrial revolution was at its peak. And when I say industrial revolution was at its peak, it means that different classes in society were created. So he was well aware of the economic disparity in the society, and that is why he supported the idea of individual property rights. He said, if you are poor, if you are rich, it doesn't matter. If you can afford to buy a land, if you can afford to buy a property, that is great. In fact, he encouraged it, which means that he was a capitalist. But at the same time, he also believed in redistribution. Now, there are different types of political policies. Some are distributive policies, some are just social impact policies, some are redistributive policies. The redistributive policies actually mean radical policies which change the economic social order by empowering the you can say the deprived strata of society through social mechanisms. For example, Benazir income support is one example of redistributive policy. The health card is one example of redistributive policy, right? Like the deprived strata of society is given more advantage. At the same time, you can see that if the working class of the society is not being taxed upon, which means that a kind of redistributive policy has been taken place, which is particular to the deprived strata of society. And Mill kind of supported economic justice and social welfare because he was concerned that industrial capitalism led to inequality and exploitation, and that is something he was against, at least theoretically. And he supported progressive taxation. Progressive taxation means that every person should be taxed according to their income. It's not like a person has 5 children and they earn 2 lakh, so they should be taxed according to what 2 lakh income person should be taxed. That's wrong. For example, if a person who earns 2 lakh and who is single, then yes, they should be taxed according to the standard set by the state. But a person who is earning 2 lakh and has many dependents on him or her, they cannot be taxed in the same way. You get my point? In the same way, progressive taxation can also be seen in the way that the poor are taxed the same amount as the rich. For example, the people who are earning 2 lakh are taxed same as someone who's earning 30,000. So that's the difference. Progressive taxation says each to your own, as in sense that, you will be taxed according to your situation, your conditions. It's like a more individualized approach to taxation. And then he talked about labor rights. Labor rights is, of course, the major idea of the socialists. And he kind of, merges socialism and capitalism in his political theory. And he also talked about inheritance taxes, that, if land needs to be inherited from one person to another, something like that, taxation should be something which should be workable. Because back in the days, the idea of inheritance was that people, especially in British, had a lot of land, and when it used to be inherited or passed it used to be passed on from one generation to another, it was just land. Like land was not adding any value to the state treasury. Like, there is land, but what good is the land doing? People won't pay tax. Why? Because they would just conceal it under the garb of inheritance land, and they would just protect themselves. So this was like his point of view, that there should be some changes. So we can say that he wanted a balance between economic freedom and social justice. At the same time, he talked about moral and civic education. He believes that education is essential for democracy, and a well-educated citizenry can exercise freedom responsibly. Education, according to him, fostered rational thinking, moral maturity, and respect for a diverse view. He even saw voting as a form of moral education. So this is something that I think he picked from the classical philosophers, because they also believed that political activity was a form of education. And then, of course, he also believed in internationalism and peace. He believed that for international cooperation, people need to be there for each other through negotiations, discussions, and there should be a principle of non-intervention that should be followed. He believed in global progress through education, trade, and diplomacy. And even though he opposed colonialism, but at the same time, we see that he kind of supports it as well. We can say that, of course, Mill was someone who was very revolutionized or enlightened from amongst the philosophers of his age. But at the same time, he had some tad bit influences of the monarchy and the kind of colonial mindset that he was grown in. So he kind of believed that, colonialism is good, because colonialism was kind of contributing in making the the colonized people better people, because it was a very xenocentric and ethnocentric point of view that the colonizers had towards the people who they had colonized. So yeah, this was something that was innate to them. It did not matter if it was John Stuart Mill or if it was Plato or Aristotle. They all had a very xenocentric and ethnocentric point of view towards the East. And then, of course, some very important points that we need to discuss include representative government and democracy, which Mill supported a lot, in which he talked about proportional representation. And he talked about representative democracy. So Mill said that representative democracy is the future, in which he believed that the population in today's world is very large. So it's not possible for every person to be their own mouthpiece for policy making. So what people can do is that in every area, people can elect a certain number of people that can represent themselves in the assemblies. Right? Makes a lot of sense, and that's the kind of political system or democracy that's being followed in today's world. And then he also talked about proportional representation. Now, proportional representation is known as population-based voting. The opposite of proportional representation is past-the-post system. Now, this past-the-post system is something that is operational or that exists today in countries like Pakistan. Now, what happened in first past-the-post system is that in any constituency, 3 people from 3 different parties will be contesting elections, and we have to vote for them, right? And XYZ person from XYZ party will win, and they'll be sitting in the assembly, right? As simple as that, because this is something that we've seen around us. But proportional representation says that if in a constituency there are 50% Christians and 50% Muslims, then there should be someone who should also be representing the Christians. Then there should be someone who should be representing the Muslims. Then if there are 49% women, which is a considerable majority, then there should be someone who should also be representing the women. You get my point? Now, it depends on the governments. Now, will they follow the proportional representation at federal level, provincial level, or local level? Now, on text, in Pakistan, the local government elections are based on proportional representation. The Nazim, Naib Nazim, councillor elections are based on proportional representation, but we all know that local government elections have not happened in Pakistan since a long time. And that's a controversy. And that's an irony, and that's something that should not happen in a federal country like that of Pakistan, because if your grassroots representation is not strong, you will be deprived of your rights and your representation. And this is what Mill said. Mill said that, diverse population and different kind of population, in which he included gender minority, he included religious minority, he wanted to uplift them. He said that to uplift this population, the minority in any region, proportional representation is important, and this should be followed. And another point which he promoted was weighted voting for the educated. He had a soft corner for educated people and for rich people, if I may say so. That is because he said that he believed in plural voting. Now, plural voting means that a person can vote more than once. As I said that, he did not believe in ignorant people being the center of attention of the electoral process, right? He did believe in everyone should have freedom of speech and everything, but still he had a tad bit of insecurity towards them, saying that they should not have that much right in political decisions because they're uneducated, right? He gave this you can say justification to prove his point. He said that if you're uneducated, you might not know how the world works. So I think this is something that he was inspired by from Aristotle. And he said that if someone is educated, someone has property, it means they have more stakes, and they should be given more right to vote over those people who are uneducated. So he said that individuals who have more education should get the right to cast multiple votes. And he argued that educated and informed citizens are better equipped to make rational and ethical political choices. He intended not to exclude the poor, but to balance democracy with competence. And at the same time, he also advocated for universal suffrage over time as education became more accessible. And we have already talked about, the civic education and all that stuff. So now we'll be talking about the criticism that was levied upon him. Okay, so some criticism points that were, raised against John Stuart Mill included elitism in voting. The point of plural voting that was raised by him garnered a lot of criticism, and critics argued that it violated democratic equality, where one person equal to one vote is a core principle. It implies that working class or less educated citizens are politically inferior, which contradicts democratic ideals. So yeah, it makes some sense, right? And it kind of raises concerns in modern democracies about voter suppression, elitism, and meritocracy versus equality, which is very relevant in modern day debate. And it kind of also justifies colonialism and promotes moral paternalism. Legally, he might say that state is not supposed to do this and that, but culturally and morally, he's promoting paternalism. He believed that the colonized nations could be improved through British rule, and they were fit for self-government until they were fit for self-government, basically. And this is often criticized as a Eurocentric and patronizing attitude promoting cultural superiority. His views were used to defend British policies in India, despite his later concerns about injustice. So yeah, John Stuart Mill also visited the subcontinent, which means that he is not a very old philosopher. In his youth, I mean, yeah, he was an old philosopher, like the the colonization of the subcontinent is many years ago, but I mean, he was still very contemporary in comparison to Plato and Aristotle. So he also created some confusion in his idea of liberty. For example, it is very difficult to explain that what is harm. When you talk about his harm principle, at one place he says that the government should interfere only when the majority is at loss. But isn't this elitism in a way where you're just supporting the majority? And then would you actually listen to the people if they were uneducated? Because you have given so much importance to education and social strata in society that it kind of limits the liberty in practice. On text it feels good, on page it feels wonderful, but it kind of creates a vagueness, and it gives states and elites room to restrict liberty in the name of protection. So yeah, this is something that is really problematic, and of course it also creates conflict between utilitarianism and rights. So we see that Mill tried to merge utilitarianism with individual rights, but this is logically difficult. Utilitarianism focuses on outcomes, like greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, while rights are absolute. In some cases, utilitarian logic could justify violating a person's rights if it benefits the majority. For example, arresting an innocent person to prevent riots may maximize happiness but violates justice. So you get my point. Again, it triggers the debate of majority versus the minority. And it is important to know that in any society, the poor or the deprived people are in the majority. But the educated people, the elite people, take the space of the minority, and they kind of regulate their policies, the kind of policies that they want to practice in society. Okay, so the next point is that he kind of overestimates the rationality of public. Now, Mill believes that if people were properly educated, they would become rational, moral citizens. But critics argue that this is too idealistic. Human behavior is often irrational, emotional, or biased, even among the educated. And we can see that in our today's world. We can see that amongst American cabinet. We can see that amongst Indian cabinet as well. Human behavior is influenced by mass media, propaganda, social pressures, and they often distort democratic participation. And the implication of this is that the kind of political model he's trying to promote, it may not work in real world democracies without strong institutions and safeguards, right? And then the last point is that he has a lot of ambiguity in balancing freedom and social good. For example, he tried to balance individual liberty with the common good, but didn't always offer clear guidelines. For example, when does public morality override private behavior? Critics argue that this blurs the line between liberalism and soft paternalism, making implementation difficult. So basically, at some points, his theory becomes too idealistic, even though he's known as the father of modern day democracy and capitalism. But still, there were a few issues that highlighted the issues and challenges that are innate to capitalism even today, that are innate to democracy even today. And I think in 2025 CSS exams, the theme of democracy and its challenges was very common. So you cannot discuss all those questions without addressing Mill's political philosophy. And To conclude, we can say that, while Mill's ideas on liberty, democracy, and equality shaped modern political thought, they were not without flaws. From elitist voting proposals to the moral defense of colonialism, his philosophy contains contradictions that continue to spark debate even today. So this was it. I'll meet you in the next video. Thank you.